Hey, gang, your pal Tim here. We apologize, but this week's winter storm here in the Midwest kind of threw a little monkey wrench into our recording plans this week. And perfect opportunity, however, though, to go back into the archives while we dig out, so to speak, literally and figuratively. And we're going to go back to May 2018. And this episode from the archives is spurred by a wonderful note that we got back over the holidays. From a guy named Russ Buhite. Now, if that name sounds familiar, well, it ought to, especially if you've been a longtime listener of this show, because this episode that we're dragging back out into the from the archives from May 2018 was with Russ Buhite's father, Russ Buhite. The episode is around the Continental League, the league in baseball that never was. And we were informed by Mr. Buhite Jr., that Russ Sr. had sadly passed away literally just weeks after we dropped that episode in 2018. Russ Jr. having just discovered this episode just a few months ago. So we were saddened to hear, but I guess delighted to know that we were able to, have the last sort of public interview with Professor Russ Buhite, he being in the minor leagues at the time in 1960, of this proposed and seemingly imminent Continental League. And we'll get into the reasons why and what ultimately happened. But it's a fascinating delve into the Continental League, the curious league that never was in professional baseball, with our guest at the time, Russ Buhite, the professor. And we thank his son, Russ, for reaching out to us over the holidays. And let's remember a great conversation. And for those of you who have not heard it before, please enjoy this chat with Russ Buhite on the Continental League, the league that never was. Please, as always, enjoy. And we'll see you with a fresh new episode next week.
All right. But, John, because of friendship's sake and everything, just let me ask one question of Chuck Connors.
You may ask one question
May I
of
ask
Chuck
you
Connors.
what other things there are?
Well, we could talk about the people who control the leagues and run them, like the league presidents and the commissioner of baseball.
Oh, is it Branch Rickey?
Branch Rickey, right. Mr. Rickey was a little bit concerned, Chuck, that he might have misled you a bit in the area of disguising his voice, which he wasn't doing, because you would remember Mr. Rickey when you were a rookie in baseball. Would that not be right?
I remember Mr. Rickey, who actually gave me my career in baseball. And it's a pleasure to see him again.
It's a pleasure to see you, too.
Thank you.
Mr. Rickey, how about that third league?
Inevitable is tomorrow morning.
Well, actually now, Mr. Rickey, the new Continental League, you have 5 cities, I believe. New York, Houston, Denver, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Toronto, is it?
Toronto.
Now, you have 3 more places. Have you had any inquiries for the other 3 places in the league?
More than we can fill. The embarrassment is in the field of exclusion rather than inclusion. We shall have a very difficult time in choosing the other 3. In fact, we're now laboring hard at the moment to choose a 6th one, which will be announced surely in the next few days.
And what is your target date for getting the league underway with a full
1961.
Full schedule?
Full schedule.
150 some odd games?
I hope.
That would be.
154. Major league schedule.
And we're going to have another team in New York. I must say that I'm not as knowledgeable about baseball, for instance, as Bennett is, who's a real fan. But I do think that New York City has lost a good deal since we've wound up with only 1 team. I think we need 2 teams, don't we, Bennett, in New York City?
It's a
The
desperate
Giants are doing
disappointment
fine
to
out in
us.
San Francisco.
Beg pardon?
I said the Giants we're still rooting for the Giants here. I am, anyhow.
I'm rooting for the Dodgers.
You'd better, Chuck.
Pittsburgh beat them today.
I think we need to add for the record that Mr. Rickey signed Chuck Connors before he learned to fire a rifle through his foot or any other place to the Dodgers. That's why Chuck is a Dodger. Thank you very much, Mr. Rickey. Wonderful to have you on West.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey, everybody. How are you? My name's Tim Hanlon, and you have come across this little podcast that we like to call Good Seats Still Available, and it is our curious little journey into the world of forgotten sports. That is what used to be in professional sports. I welcome you to the proceedings. I am honored to have you in the listening audience, putting us in your earbuds, the most intimate of audio journeys. I can't thank you enough for allowing us to attempt to entertain you, or at least educate you, or something along. Maybe just cure some boredom. Who knows? For the next number of minutes, we appreciate it. We are segueing back into the sport of baseball, which of course is an endless treasure trove of stories and rich histories and all that kind of stuff. And it's interesting because this week we're actually going to be getting into something. I think it's the first time we've ever done this, but there'll be plenty more, I assure you. An exploration in actually a league that technically never existed. Is, of course, by now, as you know in the show notes, it's called the Continental League. It was called the Continental League, or at least was proposed as such in the late 1950s. Most people of that era may remember, especially if you were a baseball fan in the New York City area, you will remember that after the end of the 1957 baseball season, not one, but two teams picked up everything that they had and abandoned New York for the West Coast. The siren song of greener pastures, if you will. The New York Giants, certainly in their, at that point, decrepit, was quickly becoming decrepit, stadium known as the Polo Grounds, moving to San Francisco. And, of course, the maybe more famously, the Brooklyn Dodgers, the team that, was always sort of there against the Yankees, occasionally, made it to the summit, but more often wound up not. Ripped the soul out of Brooklyn, of course, by going to Los Angeles. And look, New York didn't necessarily take that sitting down, shall we say. And, to see two teams kind of just ripped apart from the fabric of the New York City metropolitan area, look, there's plenty of history as to why those things happened. And some of them for good reasons and some of them for questionable ones. But make no mistake, not everybody was happy to see these two teams leave. And arguably, a bunch of the folks in the New York area who were saddened to see these teams leave, in particular, interestingly, some of the board members of the New York Giants, baseball giants, like Joan Whitney Payson, who we'll talk about in our conversation with our guest, Russ Buhite, in a second, very much, along with Robert Wagner, the mayor of New York at the time, said, we got to get a team back here. I mean, to lose two teams, that's 2/3 of baseball, and to have only one team in the biggest metropolitan area in the United States, that in the form of the New York Yankees, dominant and as they may have been, the American League, we got to get at least a National League team back here. Why not? Can't we? It's an interesting component to a much richer tableau of a story around this idea that was proposed, that came out of a lot of this consternation in New York, but then also with other folks around the country who saw that these two California cities getting franchises wondered why weren't they also starting to get some kind of love from expansion, knowing in a post-World War boom time, 1950s going into 1960s, very prosperous time in this country, that they could too also support professional baseball. Places like Minneapolis, St. Paul, places like Dallas, Fort Worth, Denver, and Toronto, Houston, various Buffalo, of course, Atlanta, all teams that named and all cities mentioned as part of this 8-team league that was proposed to launch in 1961 to push and press the issue. But we're going to get into all of that, all the various flavors of the story, whether it be markets looking for pro baseball at the highest level, whether it be New York feeling jilted, the idea of building a stadium generally in Queens. Obviously, the Jets/Titans were part of that story. Robert Moses, the architect of arguably modern-day New York City architecture and expansiveness to interesting results, not always positive. There's a whole bunch of stories related to this. And Russ Buhite is our guest. He is the author of a very interesting book. It's actually a very personal journey called The Continental League, A Personal History. And as you'll hear in our conversation with Russ in a few seconds, Russ was actually in the minor leagues at that time as a pro baseball talent, and was part of the minor league system that was committed to being part of the Denver franchise in the Continental League, and would have been Russ's shot at the major leagues had things progressed and solidified. They ultimately didn't, and we'll get into that story. But it makes it a very interesting one. It's not just sort of a look back historically. It's also filled with some very personal anecdotes and understandings of what was going on at the time, how real, how the way the press was sort of playing it up, the way key people involved in all this. We mentioned Joan Payson, clearly people like Bill Shea, after whom Shea Stadium ultimately became named, and certainly, of course, Branch Rickey, who we'll talk about as a very instrumental figure in all this. That and much, much more in our conversation with Russ Buhite in just a couple of seconds about the Continental League, the league in baseball that never was. And interestingly, the last major attempt for a third separate actual league in a competition of what the American and National Leagues exist today. Very interesting story coming up in just a couple of seconds. A couple of quick promo notes, please. Please enjoy these fine sponsors, if you will. SportsHistoryCollectibles.com. You know them. You love them. You can't live without them. If you don't know about them, well, you will soon find that you cannot live without SportsHistoryCollectibles.com, especially if you have a sports fan in your life, if you consider yourself a sports fanatic in your own life. There you go. Visit early, visit often, as they say, and you will find an amazing array of choices from the world of sports memorabilia. Some really, really cool stuff. Dean Mitchell, the proprietor of the site, he has a whole bunch of great stuff, well curated, well photographed. I urge you to bookmark it. And when you do find something that you just can't live without, and I promise you're going to find something over time, you want to make sure that you use the promo code GOODSEATS. Yep, the promo code, that's GOODSEATS. That's what it is. And you will get, of course, 15% off all of your purchases at sportshistorycollectibles.com. So give them a try. I guarantee you're going to find something. If you don't find something this week, come back next week and the week after, and don't forget that promo code. Write it down, GOODSEATS. And lastly, but not leastly, if that's a word, whatever, we made it a word, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Why do you want to go to that website, audibletrial.com/goodseats? Well, it's a good question. I'm glad you asked. That's the place where you, the listener, the person who's listening to this very podcast, can get a free audiobook download and a free month's subscription to the Audible service to listen to and enjoy an audiobook. There's 180,000 plus titles to choose from in so many different genres. We don't have time to name them all. And it is yours for the free trial. 1 month subscription to the service, and importantly, most importantly, a free audiobook download. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free stuff from our friends at Audible. Remember, you can cancel at any time, so give it a try. You will lose nothing by doing so. Get your free audiobook, enjoy the process, enjoy the book, and you tell me if you don't enjoy the experience. We thank Audible, of course, for their continued sponsorship of our little podcast. All right, let us segue, shall we, into a very fun, a very interesting, and a very personal journey with our new friend, Russ Buhite, the author of the Continental League, A Personal History. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did.
Well, I started out as a professional baseball player. I signed with the Giants, the New York Giants, in 1957, and signed with the Giants that year, with Baltimore the next year, with Washington the third year. I always tell people that 3 major league organizations saw fit to release me, and it was fine. But I think in those days it was hard to be given a chance to develop. In any case, I played. I signed with the 3 organizations, and then in 1960. When the Continental League came along, they were making contact with players released too soon or players who had been considered prospects, and contacted me, and I signed with Denver and was assigned to Forest City of the Western Carolina League. We'll follow up on that because it really is essential to the story of the Continental League. Actually, I signed with Forest City. They contacted me, the owner, informed me that I would be, quote unquote, property of Denver, but that he very much wanted me on the ball club there. And so I signed. So I played 57, 58, I was released by the Orioles. 59 was with Washington in the Florida State League. And then after Washington released me, I signed with the Continental League in the Player Development League, the Western Carolina League. Now, in times that I've talked a little bit about the Continental League, I point out that one of the reasons that it was important was that it was important to me personally. I thought, well, I had given this game a chance, and this is going to be a serious chance because players from the Western Carolina League almost certainly would stock a major league club in the Continental League. And so it was important to me, and I had a very good year in 1960. But I had a good year, but I could see a lot of things happening, could see the undercutting of the league. I paid attention to things, and I had been a reader along the way, and I don't know that I was yet a scholar, but I had university professors encouraging me to go to graduate school, put aside baseball, and go to graduate school. And a variety of reasons, I decided to, led me to decide to go to graduate school after that 1960 season. And of course, I'm glad that I did, because the Continental League went under, was really killed by the National and American Leagues. And if I hadn't gone to graduate school, and I did, the chances there of my good experiences in academia would have been more limited than they were. So that's kind of a quick history.
Oh, that's very interesting. Wow, so many things to unpack there. But let's start with the sort of, I guess, the minor league experience, right? So these minor leagues, right? So we know certainly how sort of the minor leagues, plural, sort of exist today. There's a bunch of independent ones, and obviously ones that are deeply and exclusively rooted with the major league clubs. But as you were considering or being told that the Continental League was and Denver was your future, how was the minor league system sort of apportioned, so to speak? Because you're mentioning Baltimore and Washington, obviously the minor league franchises associated with those. But where is the talent pool and the alliances for a new Continental League that didn't really even exist yet? How was that even happening?
Well, that's the thing. It didn't really exist, and that was going to be a problem, and that's really what undercut the Continental League, the whole issue of access to players. But what they did at the beginning, Branch Rickey, who, of course, had spent his entire life in baseball, built the farm systems in St. Louis and in Brooklyn, and then got the one started in Pittsburgh. Branch Rickey knew about acquiring players and how to build a good roster of players over a period of time, and what he wanted to do, he became the president of the Continental League, as you probably know, and what he wanted to do was to reach out to as many players who had been signed and released as possible. Now, these would be guys like me, who were 19, 20 years old, but who had had professional experience and had been considered prospects with the experience to build on. Many of us, the assumption was, could go on and play at a high level. So that was one area that they started looking at, the Continental League clubs. But another was college players, the belief that there would be an accelerated schedule for development of college players. And that would have been true, I think, and because colleges were starting then, 59, 60, 61, to go to longer schedules and the like. But then also, they were going to look to guys who had 8, 10, 12 years of professional experience, high minor leaguers who had been released or who had given up the game, journeyman type players to build rosters and to lead other players along through the example of their experiences. But if you start from scratch, you don't have anything. Now, Rickey was hoping that he could duplicate what Ban Johnson did in 1900 and 1901. Ban Johnson started the American League, and as he did, they were going to have a serious problem getting players. Rickey came up a little short of what Johnson did. Johnson moved into the territory of the National League. National League was the only league operating at that point, Major League. But he moved the American League into National League territory, simply began signing National League players from the Major League rosters and from high minor league rosters. Well, Rickey assumed that he could do some of that, and that he could maybe get agreement from the National and American League clubs. This would have been 59 and 60, to limit the number of players that they controlled through the reserve clause. He was hoping for a while to limit the number that a major league club could reserve to 40, the 40-man roster. Well, then he thought, well, maybe we can limit it to 60. I think his heart wasn't in it because he had benefited over the years from an unlimited reserve clause. But anyway, that's where players were going to come from. But that made it a bit iffy along the way. So they were also going to get players from a few minor league clubs, and the clubs in the Western Carolina League were all affiliated with Continental League clubs at the major league level. And Forest City, North Carolina, is with Denver, Gastonia with Atlanta, Hickory with Buffalo, Lexington, the Twin Cities, and so on. And the idea was to develop players. Well, my belief, and on reflection and looking at it carefully, certainly in this book, but prior to that as well, there was probably enough talent in the Western Carolina League to stock one major league club for the Continental League at the major league level, but not enough for 7 more. So they were going to have to rely on limiting the reserve clause that allowed National and American League clubs to hang on to so many players. Now, going back to the American League model, when they started in 1900 and 01, very soon the National League back then saw that they were going to have to come to peace with this new organization. So they signed a new national agreement very soon. I think it was 1903 that the new national agreement came into existence and codified items that were in the interests of the American League clubs, but also the National League clubs. But the player access or player development was going to be a major issue for Rickey and the Continental League, and they certainly realized it. It made the Western Carolina League quite a good league, and good things about it. There were a number of really good things about it.
Well, also, you also mentioned, it's interesting you mentioned Branch Rickey, too, because he's an interesting character in all of this, right? And arguably maybe more of a hired gun, perhaps, than some of the other folks that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But he's also interesting because he actually sort of experienced sort of the other, attempt to kind of broaden baseball's landscape with the Federal League in the teens, right? And he was sort of caught up in the St. Louis franchise there and was demoted and famously sort of, derided, I guess, by his management or his ownership about, at the time was some, more creative ideas about how to run teams and approach players and all that kind of stuff, which it just seems highly ironic given the position that he's been hired to do in this league. I guess it would be really interesting to how you balance those personal experiences with sort of the beginnings, I guess, as you look back to sort of document all of this. Why was this Continental League even a thing in the first place? Maybe we can get into some of the roots of that and maybe how Rickey got involved in the first place.
Yeah, let me correct one point that you just made, and I'll go back to how the Continental League got started. Rickey was a great proponent of the American League in 1900, 1901. And in fact, he very soon became a player with the New York Highlanders, who in 1913 became the Yankees. So Rickey was a catcher and played in the major leagues back then. But he didn't favor the Federal League. Van Johnson opposed it. Rickey thought that there weren't enough players really for a whole new major league. There probably always were enough, but Rickey didn't support. He supported the American League as a new league, but he didn't support the Federal League. He did, though, the point you made, was right. He got involved in management with the St. Louis Browns and then switched over to the Cardinals and achieved fabulous success with the Cardinals, not so much as their manager. He became the manager, but his great success with the Cardinals came in player acquisition, the establishment of the farm system in the early 20s, and the amassing of a huge number of players under his control. At one point, Rickey and the Cardinals controlled 700 players, and these are players who couldn't play for anybody else. They were limited by the reserve clause to playing for the Cardinals or the team that the Cardinals sold them to or traded them to. Now, back to the point about the Continental League and how it got going. 57, as you know, the Giants and the Dodgers got through the 57 season, but they made pretty much joint decisions. It was agreed that they could move, Giants could move to the coast, West Coast, if the Dodgers did. Dodgers could move to the West Coast if the Giants did. Well, they both moved to San Francisco, the Giants and the Dodgers to L.A. That left New York as a one-team town. The Yankees were very happy with that. Mayor Wagner was not happy with it. And generally speaking, the baseball establishment was not happy with it. Wagner appointed a committee to see what the committee could do about bringing another major league club to New York, a National League club. So they'd have the Yankees, but then they'd have a National League team as well, a team that would kind of fill the void the Dodgers and the Giants. Well, he didn't succeed in that, Wagner, needless to say. He tried bringing Cincinnati, and turned out they didn't want to move. Tried bringing Pittsburgh. These were marginal operations. They weren't making much money. So the thought was they might really be interested in moving to New York. Tried bringing the Philadelphia Phillies, to New York. And as it turned out, none of them expressed great interest in coming to New York. So Wagner urged that the committee do something else. Well, on the committee, one of the prominent figures turned out to be the most prominent figure on Wagner's committee was William Shea, Bill Shea. And Shea went to Rickey. He knew Rickey's views, and Rickey confirmed those views right away. This was in 58. Rickey said, oh, absolutely. What we need to do, though, to expand is to go the route of a third league. That's the best way to expand. You get 8 teams in a separate league from the National and American League teams. They'll play among themselves. The disparity in talent won't be so glaring. And after 2-3 years, probably 3 years at the most, Rickey said, we'll be lucky or be ready to compete with the National and American Leagues, even in a World Series, round-robin World Series. And that was the basis of Rickey's view. And he worked with with Shea very hard in 58 and then in 59 and 60. Now, in 1960, the machinations on both sides became, well, pronounced. And I deal with that extensively in the book. Rickey was threatening a war with the National and American League clubs. What he meant by war was going independent, as Ban Johnson had done in 1900, 1901, just signing everybody's players, just ignoring the reserve clause on the assumption that the Supreme Court would no longer be supportive of the reserve clause in players' contracts or the right to territorial control that baseball had held in a monopoly position for many years, well, since 1922. That's, of course, a story in itself. But as Rickey threatened that, and Shea did, the owners were nervous, but not so nervous not to fight back. And so the owners did all kinds of things to undercut the Continental League. At first, they suggested they were supportive of the third league mode of expansion. First, they said that. But then they started hinting, well, maybe we could expand the National and American Leagues by a couple of teams each. So we'll give Minneapolis-St. Paul a team, and then we'll move an expansion team into Washington. We'll put an expansion team in Houston. They began talking like this. Well, even the owners who quickly got on board as owners of franchises in the Continental League, these were people with lots of money and well-positioned. But they kind of wanted in the elite club. They didn't want to be Continental Leaguers. They wanted to be National and American Leaguers if they could be. And so they began to be undercut in this way.
So in many respects, this is an attempt by a group of men, right, well-moneyed men, to essentially, I guess, force expansion, either through traditional means or increasingly, I guess, as time wore on, maybe non-traditional means. And this, by the way, this sounds like a very familiar theme that we've experienced in some of our other conversations over the last year plus with this silly little podcast, right? So the American Football League's arrival, right, against the NFL, not too dissimilar. And frankly, the 1970s with the ABA and the WHA, it's almost sort of a recurring theme of, geez, there are places in this country, and baseball certainly at the crux of it at that point, right, where baseball as a market, as an opportunity, as a business, fertile markets that for whatever reasons are not being satiated or satisfied or even attempted. Perhaps it's time to take the things in our own hands and maybe force the issue, so to speak. So it almost feels like it's a very, very strong theme to all of this, no?
Yes, very much so. And I suggest in the book, in fact, I have a major component of the book towards the end, that the Continental Leaguers could have learned a lot from the American Football League experience, but they didn't. And one of the reasons they didn't was that they began to be effectively undercut by the National and American League clubs and they wanted to be members in good standing of the elite organization, the already existing major leagues. But to prove your point, reinforce your point, we've had since 1960 the addition of 14 new ball clubs. Isn't that right? I think it is.
Yeah.
With all the expansion that's taken place, there are lots of areas thirsty for baseball, wanting baseball, and pretty much taking advantage of it. Now, I don't know where we would go now, except to the Caribbean, to Latin America, or to East Asia. And there seems to be currently emphasis on East Asia in particular.
Well, I think you could also make the argument that there are a few franchises that exist now that could probably be better placed elsewhere. But that's for another podcast, another hot take podcast. But so let's circle around that. So July 59 or so, this league is formally announced, and maybe you can delve into some of these gentlemen and these markets that were discussed. You mentioned the AFL. I mean, Denver, obviously the team that you were promised to. Bob Howsam, right, who's also the owner, I guess, at the time of the Broncos of the AFL. You'd think that he would have some kind of sort of commonality, but maybe you can give some sense as sort of this sort of gang of individuals here who were rustled together, shall we say, to bring this Continental League some gravitas, some money, and a real shot, at least in the press and in the public's mind.
Well, they were not only people of means, but substantial people intellectually. You mentioned Howsam, of course, at Denver, but Bill Shea was going to play a role with the New York Ball Club for sure. Bill Shea was a man of multi-talent, really a good driving figure with the Continental League. The Atlanta Ball Club, that was a kind of a late addition. 5 clubs came into existence quickly, and then they added 3 more in the last part of 59, I guess, from the middle of 59 on.
And for our persnickety audience, that's Denver, that's Houston, that's Minneapolis, St. Paul, that's New York City, of course, which we'll get into a little bit deeper because that's obviously a very influential story there, and Toronto with Jack Kent Cooke.
Oh, yes, yes.
You're mentioning the 2 that sort of, or the 3 actually, that sort of came about afterwards. As the 59 and 60 came about, which was Atlanta, Dallas, Fort Worth, and then Buffalo in the early part of 1960.
Yes. And incidentally, based on your comment a few minutes ago, Buffalo is the only one of these cities that does not currently have a major league team. That's right, isn't it? I think all the rest.
That's correct.
No. Do. Yeah. But
so
it
seems like these guys were, and I say guys, right, because the New York City one was obviously led by a very powerful and baseball mad woman, which we'll get to in a second. But Jack Kent Cooke, right? This is a guy in Toronto, or rather on a Toronto franchise, right? This is a person who, was part of the later founding of things like the Washington Redskins and the NFL and the Lakers in Los Angeles and the Kings and the LA Wolves and the United Soccer Association and the Fabulous Forum and the Bob Howsam in Denver. You've got somebody like Wheelock Whitney in Minneapolis, St. Paul, who was arguably one of the great builders of and expanders of franchises in the NHL. and was a part owner of with the North Stars, a previous conversation we've had on this show, and the Vikings of the NFL, right? So it seems like these folks are not naive by any means, right? In terms of their funding prowesses and their ability to, maybe architect some quicker vision, shall we say, towards baseball's needed, arguably, expansion.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And baseball, the National and American League people played it well in the summer of 1960 and got to Shea. They got to the different owners in one way or another to get them to kind of turn and to then endorse the existing league way to expand. But you're right. These were powerful people, wealthy people, and Rickey. Well, they all agreed to this. As the league was forming, they agreed that there would be a penalty if any of them defected. I think the penalty was $2.5 million. Well, in 1959-60, that's a significant penalty. That's the equivalent of probably $20 million or close to it now. And so there was a kind of a bar against easy defection. But then when they got the assurances from existing clubs, National and American League clubs, to go to expansion, then they began jumping on that route. And Rickey couldn't hold them together. If Rickey had been a young man like Van Johnson, he might have pulled it off. I don't know. Rickey, I keep coming back to Rickey. Rickey is such an interesting figure. He was accused of putting together socialized baseball with his new economic model for the Continental League. And I point out that that's one of the really interesting features of the new league. But it wasn't a socialist model. It was really a corporate model. Rickey had in mind that the new league would operate sort of like U.S. Steel did. You would sign, the corporate entity would sign all the players and control all the players and control salaries and control training sites, control everything, managers, everything, and apportion the players to clubs as they needed them, sort of the way a large corporation would do in moving personnel around within the corporation.
All right, just when it was getting interesting, let's bring this to a grinding halt, shall we? Just kidding. We got to pay the bills around here, and our friends at Audible have been very helpful in attempting to allow us to pay some of those bills, and we want to call them out now and remind you that a free audiobook download is yours for the taking, and also a free 1-month subscription to the service of Audible at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 1-month trial of the Audible service, and most interestingly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy. 180,000 titles and growing every day to choose from, and there's absolutely no excuse to not find at least one title amongst that cavernous selection available to you that you won't find to be enjoyable and good for the soul, including a couple of books that might be interesting to our audience. And yes, some new ones, frankly. that I'm finally listening to. One that I'm listening to right now is by Carson Cunningham. It's narrated by Paul Bamer, and it's called Underbelly Hoops, Adventures in the CBA, a.k.a. the Crazy Basketball Association, which is really, of course, about the Continental Basketball Association, which for many years was sort of this ragtag minor league of the NBA. And it's a book I'm about 2 chapters into right now, and hopefully maybe a guest will get for a future episode. Also, in my queue, next up, is another guest that I'd like to get. And her book that she wrote is also narrated by her. Her name is Jeannie Buss. And of course, Jeannie is the daughter of Jerry Buss, of course, the wildly successful founder of the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Forum. And Jeannie is clearly today the brains behind the Los Angeles Lakers today. She and her brothers were active, of course, in things like, along with her father, World Team Tennis, the Major Indoor Soccer League with the LA Lasers, all kinds of stuff. So her book is next on my list. That's called Laker Girl, and that too is available on Audible. And again, it's one of the many thousands of titles that you can choose from when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you too can get your free audiobook download to give it a try, perhaps one of those 2, or perhaps one of the other 180,000 titles available to you as well. Give it a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thanks for listening, and back to our conversation. This is something that keeps coming back again and again as well, right? Which is this notion of when owners and or investors, right, come into something new and they sort of put together a structure, right? There's this tension between, shall we say, central ownership and or control, right? More of like a versus the more unfettered and more independent franchise model, right? Where, folks have a little bit more or a lot more latitude. And, a lot of the tension sort of comes around, okay, what am I investing in here? Am I going to be able to run my own team the way I want to and get the price of my franchise as high and as possible and valuable as possible? Or am I contributing to something that is actually a group effort, which may actually limit my individual capabilities of running a profit and or a sale at some point, right? And it's a very interesting dynamic because not every owner has sort of that long-term or medium-term vision to kind of take one for the collective team, so to speak, versus trying to see the immediate opportunities or perhaps maybe, blinded by opportunity to, kind of just run their own thing and get out quick and make some bucks.
Yeah. Well, we see this in all areas of sport now. We certainly see it in the NCAA, which you would think would be removed from it about as far as can be. But the NHL, the NFL, watch the NFL as they prepare for the draft. They're operating very much like a huge corporation would operate. And they've set up a system of fines for owners for speaking out or for one action or another along the way. So, the point that you make is very valid in regard to, I think, to almost all of the large sports organizations.
Well, it doesn't seem like the rules that were sort of put in place, and I'm guessing Shea and Ricky were sort of instrumental in sort of crafting these, right? Where owners basically had to agree to pay a certain amount of money to sort of, $50,000, I guess, to sort of have a place in the league and then commit an investment, a capital of, I think it was $2.5 million, not including any potential stadium costs and having even some seating capacity. 35,000, I guess, was sort of the minimum. So those seem to me kind of, I don't know, understandable rules by which all of we new potential owners can sort of play by. How much of that is socialism and corporation versus just simply good rules to kind of, get everybody in the same room? I don't know. Sure.
And you can't have anarchy in any sort of system. You got to make it work somehow. And But I was just suggesting in my prior comment that it's not exactly right to call Rickey a socialist in what he's trying to do with baseball in 1959 and 60. It's interesting, though, I saw this in the Western Carolina League. Players, well, it just didn't operate like other minor leagues. It was very clear that, at least at the beginning, Bert Schotten and Al Todd were evaluating players, and players were apportioned according to what Rickey thought were the needs of given ball clubs. Players signed out of college. Rickey had this, I think his most recent signee was Dick Grote from Duke, but he had this notion that you could bring in college players. Well, he had brought in Johnny and Eddie O'Brien from Seattle to Pittsburgh as well, the O'Brien twins. But Rickey thought, yeah, you get these college players, they're smart, they know how to live and know how to play, they've had enough experience. He got a couple players for us that way, one from Pfeiffer College, a guy who had been a pitcher at Pfeiffer College, and then second baseman, infielder from Lafayette College, and he just went on and on about their great virtues. Well, they were good players, and they were wonderful teammates. One of them has remained a close friend of mine even to now. But they weren't what Rickey hoped they would be. But that's what he did. That's the way they ran the minor league. It was run with the central organization very much in mind. And that was an era when that wasn't done. There was a lot more in that period of, going back in minor league baseball, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, a lot more autonomy, individual control ball clubs than there came to be later on.
So that's interesting, because that brings me back maybe to sort of the New York exodus, shall we say, in 57, which arguably, or past 57, which arguably kind of set a lot of the tone and motion for this, because, those, while needing, I guess, the approval of other league owners in the National League at the time, right? The idea of moving two teams simultaneously, two very dramatic changes of locale, and going 3,000 miles away to establish basically new. I mean, that feels autonomous to me, right? And arguably, it maybe even sets some of the seeds for trying to centralize some of the ownership and the control in the years that followed. But maybe we could talk about sort of the Giants in particular, and a woman by the name of Joan Payson, because it seems to me that that she is also a very interesting and influential figure in all of this. Not only in addition to Branch Rickey and to Shea, because she's kind of the one that that kind of maybe pushed sort of the New York story maybe to the front of the conversation, perhaps. No?
Yeah, you're right. Plus, the Giants weren't making money. The Giants were known as a fairly poor franchise in the late 50s. And the Dodgers were certainly not all that Walter O'Malley thought they could be. But the Giants had that old ballpark. The Polo Grounds was decrepit. I guess you could say the same about Ebbets Field. But the ballpark that the Giants played in was really not satisfactory, and something needed to happen. Whether they could have their situation improved or not. Nowadays, I guess you just build a new Yankee Stadium. If you need it, you just build it.
Well, I guess what I was sort of getting at is that, and again, this is my bias having grown up in the New York area, right? It seems that obviously between what Ms. Payson and what Shea were involved with, obviously Branch Rickey having been in the New York area for quite some time, the idea of, it seems like a lot of the impetus kind of generated around sort of a core of getting New York a second team, and then by, in some respects, almost sort of branching that out a bit into, there are other markets that could benefit besides New York getting a second team, and sort of the sort of overall halo of expansion. It just feels to me that the whole New York thing, and maybe this is having grown up as a kid being a nominal Mets fan, is a sort of a, with Shea Stadium, obviously named after Bill Shea, and all the sort of things behind it. It almost feels like that once, and you mentioned it earlier, maybe we get some more detail, once the American and National League started to kind of budge, I guess, in terms of maybe starting to drip out plans for expansion, maybe a little bit faster than was prior to the announcement of this Continental League. It almost feels like once the Mets were effectively deemed a franchise, that the whole notion behind a continental separate third league kind of dissipated and rather quickly. No?
Yeah, it did. It's interesting, though, some of the leaders, Rickey, of course, included, believed that this was absolutely, totally the wrong way to expand. Rickey said to everybody who would listen, these people are not your friends. They're cutthroat operators who will be attacking one another, competing for players all over the place, trying to do their opponents in, and they're gonna finish last, and so they won't be able to compete. Well, I suppose the one ball club that gives lie to that the quickest was the Los Angeles Angels. They finished a few years later. They finished third or fourth, but the Mets weren't any good for a long time, and so Rickey and some others just thought, oh man, this is not the right way to do it, and they talked it down a lot, but there was this sort of inexorable baseball momentum, expansion momentum that built up. I mean, I think you're right on that point, and it continued, and with each passing expansion, they've done a little better about the clubs and the players available for draft and the other things. The supporters of the Continental League, I still believe, in my own experience, that the Continental League would have been the way to go if the National and American League clubs, and I keep saying National and American League clubs because Ford Frick didn't run baseball. The owners really ran things. But if they had been more cooperative, I've been willing to loosen up on the reserve clause, made more players available, they could have made expansion work, and I think it would have worked better. But it came to work.
Well, it seemed like the American and National Leagues took this thing seriously enough, right? I mean, the money was there.
Oh, yes.
You had baseball people and people like Ricky in there. You had Shea, who was a lawyer and certainly understood sort of the intricacies. Obviously, part of trying to get a new stadium built there as well as sort of the economics and the real estate aspect of it. I just wonder. I don't know who was bluffing whom, right? Because at some point, it feels like that it never launched, right? And although there were enough aspects of this thing that were happening, it caved in pretty quickly, right? Once that sort of concession sort of came about. I'm just wondering who blinked, right?
Well, that's an interesting question, a very interesting point. And Ricky did not quickly enough, it seems to me, or firmly enough, disavow the notion that he had set all this up and that what he wanted was expansion, and he didn't care if it was the National and American Leagues. He didn't care if it was the Continental League. He didn't, once expansion of the regular clubs became the route, Ricky sort of was willing to maybe bask in glory that he didn't deserve. Because if you read the Ricky papers, read the documents, man, he is firmly and bitterly opposed to these guys who made expansion happen in the other way. But then, when he saw the inevitable, I think he just sat back and thought, well, okay, let's go with that. And when he would be asked, he didn't comment too much as time went along. And he moved to St. Louis again, went to work for the Cardinals again after the summer of 1960.
Well, in February of 60, right, the February 18th, as a matter of fact, of 1960, is when the league folks actually revealed a whole bunch of specific plans, including an opening date of April 18th, 1961. But it's interesting, and I don't know any of the details here, but it was Ricky and Jack Kent Cooke making that announcement. So I'm wondering, like, what was Cook's role? Like, why was he versus, say, the others, why was he the sort of owner person representative, I guess, of that, right? Was Cooke really, sort of behind all this as well? And or, was this announcement made with any knowledge that some of these new franchises were going to be at least thrown into the mix by National and American leagues? Or was it, I wasn't there at the time, right? So the dynamic of that announcement, right, was that sort of fully in the belief that this is going, or this is sort of another act in some theater that, ultimately, and pretty quickly, right? I think by August of 60, the whole thing had been disbanded. So
yeah, August. Yeah, well, you could be right about the theater aspect of it. No, I don't think so. At that time, in February, the owners who were most dynamic were Cooke and George Kirksey in Houston, and Bill Shea, along with Ricky. And I think Kirksey, there was no doubt about Kirksey's faithfulness, and I don't really think so about Jack Kent Cooke at this point either. And I think that Ricky was coming off a kind of a high at the end of the year of 1959, and then they set up the Western Carolina League. Houston wanted 3 or 4 development leagues. I don't know what the Toronto ball club was favoring. But you're right in saying we weren't there. You can't, when you're not there, you can't read facial expression. You can't read lots of things that you might understand better if you were. It's like understanding the Constitutional Convention of the spring and summer of 1787. If you could have been in the room, there are lots of things you could understand better than now in hindsight.
So what do you, in your perspective, from your perspective, right, as somebody who almost would have gone into this league, right? So when you were in the farm system, what were you being told? And what was your feeling? And how much of it was, how much belief did you have, and or when did you sort of see the sort of writing on the wall that this league was not going to happen?
Yeah, I followed it mainly in the sporting news. And with one or two teammates. Nobody was talking about it very much. They were interested in the league continuing to function. The league was pretty well funded, quite well funded actually, and we wanted that to continue and not fold. So many leagues were folding, minor leagues in those days, and we didn't want that to happen. But I was looking at it a little bit differently than most people. I thought that this held out a real opportunity for me and maybe some of my teammates. Some of my teammates maybe even better than me. But I certainly found it where I think lots of guys didn't, and across the league they didn't. But I would say by mid-July, by July 20th, 22nd, 23rd, one of the dates along in there, it looked to me like the Continental League was going to fold. That is, the major league operation was going to be undercut. And I remember that pretty well because I talked with the owner. The owner of the ball club in Forest City was a good guy. He liked to drink a little. And I never hesitated to talk to him about things, ask him questions about different things. And I think I got a pretty good scoop from him that there wasn't much chance of the Continental League itself becoming a major league in 61 and 62 and on. Though I think he believed, and it was true, of course, that the Western Carolina League was going to continue. He was pretty bullish on the Western Carolina League. Now I remember that pretty distinctly. But other than those things, been a long time ago. A lot of other things happened in my life, but that's kind of the way I remember it.
Well, look, if the Continental League had actually happened, though, do you think, and assuming your play was decent enough to get a look, you think you would have played the next year in Denver?
Well, here's the question. Here's the issue. The next year, it would have had to operate. If it had operated, I probably would have played because I wasn't really tired of playing, and I assumed that I could go to graduate school at some point. But I loved the game and wanted to play. If the Denver Ball Club of the Continental League didn't operate as a Continental League club, all the players, including myself, were under the control of the Tigers, Detroit, who had the general working agreement with Denver of the American Association. So that was a conflicting issue in my thinking in the fall and winter of 61. They sent me a contract, Denver did, but I knew that because the Continental League had folded or been undercut, that I'd have to make it within the Tigers system, and I probably wasn't going to have a chance to play in the American Association. Now, I learned in going through the Rickey papers and looking at all the evaluations of players, in my own case, I received pluses for running speed, pluses for strength of throwing arm, pluses for fielding, but flat line for home run power. And I was listed in each case where I saw a listing as AA. Now, I think that what that meant, I'm pretty sure, that meant that that's what they saw, that I would be a good AA player. But once you've identified yourself as a good or decent AA player, well, you can play beyond that. Certainly play beyond that. I didn't have any question about my abilities along the way, but I didn't hit home runs. And as a first baseman outfielder, realistic thoughts probably would have taken over before very long. So I might have played for another year, maybe not beyond that. I don't know. But that AA, that's interesting when I look at it now from the perspective of a nearly 50-year academic career. Well, I could have been a AA ball player and had a life of maybe managing in the minor leagues and riding buses and doing this and doing that. That would have been it.
Well, there might have been some silver lining though. So as you make your own decision about moving on to your extended academic career, I'm wondering if some of your teammates and others around you at the time had, even maybe if you were incapable of doing so, but looking sort of somewhat longer term, because it does seem that around that time, despite the demise of this Continental League, which never fully actually launched, there was movement towards opening up more fertile franchise territory for more teams in Major League Baseball, right? So that sounds like that translates to eventual, although not immediate, opportunity for more players, no?
Yeah. Well, I tell you, I know I could play first base better than Marv Throneberry. I couldn't.
Many people could have.
I couldn't have hit the home runs that Throneberry hit, though. The great story, my favorite story about Throneberry, he hit a triple one night. Casey Stengel was coaching at third base. I think he was, but Throneberry was called out for missing second base, and Stengel reminded him that he had missed first base too in circling the bases. I wouldn't have done that. I knew how to touch them all in the times that I did it. So yeah, it's interesting. There were ball clubs available, and there would have been some chances. Yeah, would have been. But so much depends on how well you play at a given time, how you show up at a given time. You make the most of the opportunities that exist. I saw so many guys over the years who were talented, I mean talented beyond belief, who just couldn't play. They didn't know how to play, or they just couldn't play. On the other hand, I've seen so many players over the years who had just marginal ability, but who made themselves great players. Dick Groat, for instance. Dick Groat couldn't run, he couldn't throw, but he was an outstanding major league shortstop. David Eckstein, who most recently played for the Angels and the Cardinals, he didn't have major league ability, but he certainly showed it. Pete Rose couldn't run very well. Pete Rose didn't have a very good arm. He could certainly hit, and proved himself in that sense. But you can go through the histories of Major League Baseball and identify just lots of players who might not have been great on the ability side, but showed up well enough, showed that they could play, got a chance, and had good long careers. So a lot depends, I suppose, on maybe what we call intangibles. You think? I think so.
You know, I hope that you truly appreciate, there, fine listeners, the service that we do for you every week here at Good Seats Still Available. If you are not benefiting and taking advantage of all this knowledge about sports history, and forgotten sports history at that, such as our conversation with Russ about the Continental League and its importance, and for people who don't know about it, and the importance of what it represented and put into motion. When you go to cocktail parties, or you're on the golf course with the buddies, or you're sitting on the sideline watching your kid's soccer game and you're trying to come up with some interesting chatter to get through the game and the weather perhaps on the sidelines. These are tidbits of great value, and I hope you're using them wisely in your conversations and your exploration of discussions with various people in your daily lives. I hope that you're finding this stuff as interesting as I do. I find it fascinating, and I know a certain segment of you out there in listener land do as well. I know this because you are very kind to send us some notes and some tweets and some emails and all that kind of stuff, and we appreciate that. We also appreciate you doing that on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, of course, where you can search up this episode with Russ Buhite, and also when you find that episode, you can click on some links there. You see some great photography that we unearthed about the Continental League and its positioning and all the various people involved. And of course, you can find the link to the book, The Continental League, A Personal History. It is published by our friends at the University of Nebraska Press. And by buying the book or clicking through that link on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, you will, of course, give us a little financial love, a few shekels, if you will. And that's a good thing for us because that helps defray some of the costs for getting this silly little podcast out there and into the ether and into your earbuds. So we appreciate you doing that. And while you're at goodseatsstillavailable.com, make sure that you also click around to find out our various social media places where you can follow us during the course of your day. We'd like to put out imagery and tout what's going on this week in the show. People tweet at us, and we certainly like to respond, and we appreciate you doing that. So at Twitter, you want to find us at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. And you will also find a little Facebook page devoted to our show as well. As long as we decide to stay on Facebook, who knows? It's a day-to-day proposition, but for all intents and purposes, we're still there now. You'll find us there too. And again, of course, you know the website. Feel free to visit us early and often, send us some email, etc. Lots more good stuff coming up in the weeks and months to come. Again, we appreciate your responses to the show. We're overwhelmed. We've certainly tapped a nerve, we think, with this kind of programming, and we appreciate to no end your support and listenership. So until next week, I bid you all a fond adieu, and I wish you nothing but safe travels and goodness until we talk again. Take care, everybody.